Good day. This is February 14th, 2025, and this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you with our latest installment of the Global Economy Report on Reason to Resist with Costas Lapavitsas. Costas is a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. In Greece's January 2015 election, he was elected as a member of Greece's parliament for the Syriza party. In that election, Syriza ran on a platform of opposition to austerity. But in the summer of 2015, as many Greeks painfully recall, and after former Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras capitulated to the demands from Greece's creditors for new and harsher austerity, Kostas defected from Syriza. In our last episode, Kostas, and thank you very much for joining me again, we focused on the tariffs that Trump had threatened to impose upon Canada and Mexico, and I would like to return to that subject today. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you about Elon Musk and his so-called Department of Government efficiency. Now, of course, Musk is a businessman and never tires of telling us about his fantastically successful business career. And as such, he seems inclined to approach the question of government efficiency in the way that he would approach the question of corporate efficiency. Could you talk to us about the differences between the finances of a state and the finances of a corporation? And do you think that a business-oriented approach to enhancing U.S. government efficiency is likely to be good for the U.S. economy in the long run?
You've gone right to the heart of it, Dimitri. What Elon Musk is trying to do to the federal administration of the United States is part and parcel of what Trump generally tries to do. And here we've got clear evidence, I think, of madness in the method, but not much method in the madness. Not much method that I can detect, and it holds for Musk. Musk himself across as this very intelligent, very exceptional genius of business. Actually, his business trajectory has always been closely connected to the states. Various states. He would never have been what he is without very tight connection to the state. But anyway, he's taken the knife, or appears to be taking the knife, to the US federal administration. He's presenting this as shaking the bureaucracy and getting rid of inefficiency and waste and all the rest. And it fits with Trump's message. Now, I've got news for Musk. He's engaged in a labor of Sisyphus. He will not succeed. The reason is clear. He doesn't quite understand what state administration is. He thinks that it is business. He thinks that he's dealing with Twitter. He's not. He's dealing with the US federal state. States are not businesses because they are not driven by the profit motive. They're not supposed to be, and they are not driven by the profit motive. They are supposed to be driven by public spirit, by managing society as a whole. And they are trained of social conflict and social confrontation. Different social interests are expressed through the state mechanism. It's a terrain of class struggle. And obviously, the capitalist class typically has the upper hand, but it doesn't control everything. That's not how the state works. It works through conflict, as I said, and opposition. Now, in the case of the United States, you can see it clearly. The United States federal government runs a deficit of 1.9 trillion a year. It's huge. Huge. Trump and Musk has promised to eliminate it. He aims for 2 trillion. That is impossible. Why? Because total expenditure by the US federal state is about $6.75 trillion a year. 2/3 of that are for social security, for health in its various forms, and for the military. These are very, very fixed wheeled expenditures, and Musk will discover that. And they are fixed and unwieldy because this is not a business. This is dealing with society. If he takes the knife and significantly cuts with that, the first people who are going to know it are going to oppose it, and we're going to rebel at Trump voters. That's what's going to happen. And rightly so. Rightly so. This ain't Twitter. This is not X. This is the federal state that is supposed to be dealing with the US economy as a whole. So he will rapidly discover, as we know from a lot of experience of dealing with fiscal deficits. He cannot deliver anything like the he's hoping to deliver. He will find that out. In the process, though, he's creating chaos, absolute chaos. From what I understand, from what we can gather from the news, because it's very tight knit and secretive. He's invited a number of millionaires and billionaires from Silicon Valley, people like him, who are enormously arrogant and believe in their own cleverness. You know, if you come across any of these types, you will know. They think that they are basically God's gift to the world. He's invited a small group of those people who've arrived as an outside force in the midst of the federal government. And they haven't got power to cut directly, but they can make suggestions and Congress will approve. In doing that, they've taken command, I believe, of computers and all kinds of information provision of that type, and they've alienated the civil service. If I were a federal administration employee right now, I would be deadly scared. I wouldn't have any spirit towards work. I wouldn't want to go anywhere near it, and I would want to oppose Musk. And that's what's going to happen. That is a recipe for paralysis. It's a recipe for no effectiveness.
Mhm.
Not because he doesn't understand how states work. That is not to deny that the US federal state needs reform. I'm not denying it for a minute. Of course, everybody knows that. But how do you effect reform of the state? Not as a business. And not through Silicon Valley millionaires. You effect reform of the state by pressure from below, by social organization, and by having a clear direction of where you want it to go, the kind of state you want to see emerge, and the kind of society you want the United States to be. You don't engage in it aiming to cut $2 trillion from expenditure, which is impossible.
Mhm.
So Musk will soon discover that his genius will come short.
Yeah, Costa, what I find most absurd about this whole discussion about Elon Musk enhancing US government efficiency is that quite arguably the biggest source of waste and fraud in the US government's budget is military spending. There are epic levels of abuse taking place on the part of military contractors. This is a scandal of decades-long proportions in which the United States Congress is fully complicit, and it appears from their rhetoric that they're actually going to dramatically increase, the food they're going to dump into the trough for the military-industrial pigs. So I completely concur that I think they're in for quite a surprise. Let's turn next to the subject of.
But is that what I mentioned before? There is no method that one can detect in the madness. It's just one thing and then another. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And this, incidentally, before you ask me the next question, is not accidental. If I may say generally, Trump seems to realize that the old, as it were, in other words, globalization, liberalization, and so on, all these things that we've lived with for 4 decades and more, don't work anymore. He seems to realize that they've exhausted themselves, certainly in the case of the United States, and possibly globally. And he's lashing out against that. He's attacking it in an uncoordinated and almost blind way. But the thing that Trump is not doing is to tell us what the new will look like, because he doesn't know. And you talk to people who are involved in policymaking in the United States, and I've got people that I know in monetary policymaking and so on, and they'll tell you in horror, there is no strategy. There's no strategy that we can detect. And that is not accidental. That is attacking the old, but not being able to tell us what the new will look like or to create the new in any coherent way. That's a symptom of what I, in my work, as you know, I've called the interregnum, the period in between, when the old doesn't work, but the new cannot be born. And so what you get is monsters churning, bizarre phenomena. Trump is a reflection of the interregnum. That's basically, in my reading, that's basically what's happening. And you can see it in the economy. You can see it in the state that we've discussed. You can also see it in geopolitics.
This is precisely what I wanted to ask you about next. He started out, as we talked about on our last episode of the Global Economy Report, threatening Mexico and Canada with 25% across the board tariffs. The Mexican president and the Canadian prime minister made some commitments about border security. Justin Trudeau appointed a drug czar, whatever that is. And in response, Trump appears to have withdrawn his threat of tariffs against Mexico, at least across the board tariffs, and suspended his threat with respect to Canada, I believe, for 30 days. So then what does he do? He comes up with a new tariff scheme. He's going to impose 25% tariffs on all aluminum and steel. And in the process of imposing these tariffs, eliminates exemptions that had previously existed for Canada and the European Union in terms of exports of steel and aluminum to the United States. It just seems like he's flailing around, coming up with one tariff bomb after another, withdrawing a plan, modifying it. What are the fundamental problems, or what is the fundamental problem you think he's trying to address? And what should he be doing to address that problem?
Is it so much here, right? Let's start with steel for a start. The United States is a major steel producer. Doesn't produce nearly as much as China. China produces a number of times more, incomparably, more than 10 times what the United States produces. India produces a lot more than the United States. These are the biggest steel producers in the world. Russia produces almost as much as the United States, incidentally. Steel is, of course, and aluminum are, of course, what makes manufacturing run. If you don't produce steel and aluminum, you don't really have your own manufacturing industry. That's the reality of it. And steel is also what wars are fought with, incidentally. You can produce all kinds of paper that you shove about in Wall Street. You never win war with simply shoving paper about. You need steel, right? So the United States government and Trump realized that they've got a problem with steel. Steel production is weak, and they want to do something about it. And what do they do about it? They impose tariffs. On whom? On Canada, primarily. Canada is the country that will suffer most from these steel tariffs. So he's alienating Canada, which will reciprocate in all probability in some way or another in the future. But he's trying to fix the steel production thing. That's what he's trying to do with tariffs. And it's the same logic across with the reciprocal tariffs that he introduced yesterday. What are these reciprocal tariffs? Well, basically, the European Union has a value-added tax. That's a consumer tax that companies pass on to consumers and the state collects. That's 20%, 18% across the European Union. And obviously, American products that come to the European Union are subjected to that tariff. The United States, to that tax. The United States doesn't have VAT. It has sales taxes. Sales taxes are much lower than VAT. So obviously, EU exports to the United States have got a much lower sales tax than the VAT imposed on American exports to the European Union. So tariffs, Trump says, I will equalize them. I will impose a tariff that will raise the effective tax on EU imports into the United States. Okay. What's he hoping to achieve with that? If you want to avoid it, he says, come to produce in the United States. Re-strengthen my industrial base, basically. And reduce the current account deficit of the United States, especially the trade deficit, which is enormous. Enormous. 3%, 3.5% of GDP. What will be the outcome? It's very big. It's 3.5% of GDP. What will be the outcome? In all probability, it will obviously be higher consumer prices for US working class people and middle class people, because that's what happens to essentially sales taxes imposed in that way. What's Trump hoping for? Because he doesn't want to see that. What's he hoping for? He's hoping that the dollar will continue to strengthen. And as the tariffs are imposed, the dollar strengthens and the dollar price remains the same. That's basically that's the calculation, I think, from what if we can infer any calculation, any method in this madness, right? This is what happened in 2018. They imposed tariffs on China, but the dollar strengthened soon after the imposition of the tariffs on China. The dollar strengthened, and the dollar price of Chinese exports did not rise. Effectively,
Before you, I just want to ask you a question about that. Does the evidence suggest, in your view, that the reason the dollar strengthened was because of the tariffs, or was it really extraneous reasons and he just got lucky?
Separate. Now I'll come to that in a minute. Separate. He was just very fortunate that the dollar strengthened while the tariff was imposed on China in 2018. So US consumers and businesses did not bear the tariff. What happened was that the dollar price remained roughly the same. The Chinese paid the tariff. That's basically what happened. The Chinese took the burden of the tariffs that he imposed on 2018 and imposed their own tariffs, incidentally, but that's another, reciprocal tariffs, but that's another story. I think Trump is hoping for the same, insofar as we can tell, insofar as there is any kind of strategy. He's hoping for the same. He obviously doesn't want to hit his own people, his own voters, with higher consumer prices. And he's hoping that the dollar will probably continue to strengthen, and therefore American consumers will not feel it in the way that is likely. Well, I've got news for him on that too, because 2025 is not 2018. The dollar has been very strong because there's a bubble in Wall Street, which is attracting capital from across the world. But there is no guarantee and no evidence that it will continue indefinitely, and certainly not for the period of time that Trump wants to see. In addition to that, US public debt is currently 35 trillion. In 2018, it was 21 trillion. Public debt of the United States during that period, in those 7 years, has increased by more than 50%. That's the outcome of the pandemic and the spending that the Biden administration engaged in. In those conditions, the threats to the dollar are very, very severe. Very severe. So will the dollar continue to strengthen? Nobody can tell what the exchange rates will do. Obviously, anybody who tells you that they know what the exchange rate will do is lying. But Trump is hoping that it will rise. Well, it might well not. If it doesn't, Trump will know it, or rather his voters will know it. So this will backfire. And that is part and parcel of this, again, mad policy, no strategy. He's hoping to revive the industrial base of the United States by imposing these tariffs and to reduce the deficit in this way. In other words, he's attacking the old. He's attacking this free trade period. He's attacking this produce anywhere you like and cross borders. He's attacking all that stuff that we've lived through the last few decades. But has he got a strategy? No, I don't see the strategy.
So if first of all, do you think it's a laudable goal, reindustrialization of the United States? And if you think that, and I'd like your thoughts as to why it is or is not a good idea at this stage of the economic development of the United States. And if it is a goal that ought to be pursued, how do you think he ought to pursue it? What would be an effective strategy for pursuing that goal?
It's an absolutely laudable aim. That's exactly what should happen. And it should also happen in Europe, incidentally. The shifting of industrial capacity away from the United States, away from continental Europe, towards Asia has been a disaster, absolute disaster, the last few decades. Indeed, we need to reindustrialize. And there are policies through which we can reindustrialize, and I can tell you what I think these are. One fundamental element there, however, and again, it shows you how much Trump doesn't really get it or doesn't really want to give it direction, is, of course, global financialization. In other words, the freeing of the current account. The fact that people who are rich, or banks, or hedge funds, or investment funds, all those vast institutions of the financial system that have become bloated the last few years, can shift capital in and out of countries essentially without controls. Which holds for the United States. The biggest obstacle to a sustained policy of reindustrialization is, of course, the liberalization of finance. The United States cannot really successfully reindustrialize unless it does something about finance. And obviously, Trump will not do that because the man at the Treasury that he appointed is this fellow, Scott Bessent, who is exactly the voice of finance. He's a hedge fund manager. and someone who comes straight out of Wall Street. He's also a millionaire. I'm sure he's a millionaire. All of them are millionaires, these types. So will they do something about it? Not a word. Nothing. There's been not a word about the capital account, although Trump is talking so much about tariffs on goods. But the benefits of lifting control on capital account, liberalizing the capital account, the benefits for growth, the benefits for real wealth production are in that it cannot be decided, cannot be determined. There's no work that tells you that actually this has benefited humanity. It's 4 decades of it. It's benefited a lot of people who've become very rich. But has it benefited the wealth production across the world? Well, there is no evidence at all. What it has also done is, of course, to increase instability. The crises that we see repeatedly over the last few years emanate in finance or are exacerbated by finance. So if there is to be a policy of reindustrialization and real wealth production and good job generation in the United States, the first thing that has to happen is controls over finance, controls over the ability of these people to operate internationally, controls over capital flows, controls over this enormous casino, this speculative paradise in which all these people make millions. But Trump is not saying anything about it. Trump is not talking.
So am I understanding correctly that by imposing intelligent restrictions on the flow of capital out of the country, the owners of capital would be obliged to invest locally in production, in producing, enhancing productivity within the United States and so forth, in order to, is that the notion that in order for them to earn a decent profit, once they're restricted from, just seeking whatever the temporary most profitable location may be for their capital, always, provoking, exacerbating a race to the bottom globally, they would be forced to invest domestically? Is that why restricting capital flows are important to reindustrialization?
It's partly that, but more than that, it is removing the instability and the lack of certainty that finance generates. It is actually removing the outside control. In places outside the United States, this is usually called the dictatorship of the bond markets. You want to engage in a policy that seeks to boost wealth production and industrial capacity creation. The first problem you will confront is, of course, the bond market. It's all these people who move their money in and out of a country more or less freely and tell you, no, you can't do that because I will withdraw my money, then you will get a foreign exchange crisis. To a certain extent, the United States is free of that because of the extraordinary position of the dollar. The extraordinary position of the dollar, which basically is the world money. People use it for all kinds of transactions. But that also has costs for the United States. It has costs because to have the dollar in that position, you have to supply others with dollars. In other words, you've got to run deficits because if you've got surpluses, you're not supplying them with dollars. You see what I mean? The United States runs a deficit, huge deficit, and to pay for the deficit, it creates dollars. And everybody holds dollars abroad, and therefore the dollar becomes the world money. And therefore the United States has got the exorbitant privilege of holding the dollar. It's a vicious circle, right? It's got to be broken. It's got to be broken, and the first step in breaking it is to begin to impose controls on the capital account, controls on the movement of capital, from which, I repeat, the benefits are not discernible. We cannot see any real benefits for wealth production from this policy. And incidentally, we don't have to go very far to demonstrate that in practice. Look at China. China has had extraordinary growth the last few decades, which has improved the living standards of the Chinese people and has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, right? Real wages have been rising in China for a long time now, 2 decades practically. And you can see the evidence of it by looking at the Chinese middle class traveling across the world, right? Which would have been unthinkable 3-4 decades ago. China has got extensive controls on the capital account. China has got a publicly owned banking system in good part. The biggest banks are publicly owned. And he has got extensive controls on the capital account. It controls money going out, and usually it controls money coming in. You can't move your money in and out of China as you wish, as you can in the United States. Has China suffered for it? Not visibly. Obviously, the conditions change, and China will have to rethink what it's going to do as it becomes a bigger and a richer economy and as it plays a global role, as it emerges as a competitor globally, of course. But that doesn't take away the fact that the capital account remains controlled, and that is a major boost to the ability of the Chinese to create wealth, something from which the United States has suffered for 4 decades now. But again, Scott Bessent, he is the man who is running the Treasury. Don't expect any serious interventions and reforms and so on from that Trump administration.
If the Chinese government were minded to attempt to replace the US dollar as the global reserve currency with the Chinese yuan, would they have to lift these capital controls? Would they have to effectively allow money to flow in and out of China freely, Chinese currency, I mean? And this is something, do you think, that they're ultimately trying to do and ought to do, to replace the US dollar as the global reserve currency?
Now we're going to the heart of the global hegemony problem. That's basically what you're doing. You're putting your finger on it. Because obviously the hegemonic power hitherto has been the United States. And its hegemony is derived from economic preeminence and military preeminence. Now, neither of these things is nearly as powerful as it was before. Militarily, the United States is not as dominant, nearly as dominant as it used to be, and nor is it economically. When you look at the economic situation, which is what you're asking me, you see that in the realm of production, the United States remains a very serious player, but manufacturing production, industrial production has migrated to the east. I mean, just about in everything that matters except for AI. And even that, the Chinese are making very great strides. The workshop of the world is China and the surrounding areas, Vietnam, Korea, to a certain extent, Japan, and so on. So the economic predominance in terms of production is not really US anymore. It's the same with trade. The US used to be the predominant trading power until very recently, if you add exports and imports together. Right? It was the biggest trading power. No longer. China is now bigger. But where the US retains its predominance is in finance. Is in precisely this area, which I said is the biggest problem for the US economy. And that's where the political power also comes from. In finance, the US retains its predominance. And that predominance derives from a number of things. The biggest network of banks, global banks, US, the biggest investment funds, hedge funds, and so on. These speculators in shares and bonds are US. The biggest market in finance is in the US, New York, and so on. And crucially, the biggest pivot of globalized finance is US, the dollar. The dollar is world money. Banks globally operate using the dollar. Banks transact and clear accounts using the dollar. The US controls that through SWIFT and other mechanisms, and is very, very careful to continue to control it. A key lever in that is the Federal Reserve. People don't realize. They see the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, as a very important player domestically, which it is, right? If there is a problem with the US banking system or the economy, the Federal Reserve intervenes. But an equally important role, and globally even more important, is what the US Federal Reserve System does with regard to swaps, foreign exchange swaps. When there is a crisis globally, as there was in 2020, when the pandemic hit, as there was in 2007, 2009, which is when the great crisis hit. When there is a global crisis and other countries begin to feel the pinch of not having enough dollars, because that's what happens in a global financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve System intervenes and makes dollars available through foreign exchange swaps with other central banks, selected central banks, not all the central banks. There is a list of countries with which the United States has got special arrangements, countries like Mexico, some countries elsewhere across the world, which are provided with dollars to allow them to deal with crisis, because dollars is how the global system works, if the Federal Reserve agrees to it. That's a major source of imperial power for the United States. The imperial power of the United States draws on that. And that is, of course, supplemented by its military power. China and other countries want to challenge that. That is the nature of contemporary hegemonic struggles. That's basically what's happening. They understand that the control over the world money by the United States through this mechanism that I've outlined to you is crucial for hegemonic power. And they want to challenge it. Easy. It's not easy. They cannot easily translate dominance in production and dominance in trade into dominance in finance. It's not easy at all, because the financial system is not particularly receptive of change. It is rigid in its way, and it gets very nervous and worried about it. So creating an alternative world currency, which is what people talk about, the BRICS or China, is nice on paper and easy on paper, very, very difficult to do in practice. For the Chinese in particular, the problem is very serious. They would have to liberalize, as you indicated. They would have to open up, because think about it. I am, say, an Indonesian business. I trade with the United States, but I also trade with Japan, and I trade with China. Usually trade in dollars. But I don't want to trade in dollars, and I want to trade in another currency. Maybe the Chinese central bank creates. Would I trust my capital in that? You see, would I be able to take it in and out? It's not so clear.
Right.
So creating another currency is far more difficult than people imagine, and the United States will fight it tooth and nail every inch of the way, because they realize that's ultimately where the hegemony lies. Trump is very clear about that. He's repeated it a number of times. That he understands.
Right. Right. So the last question I wanted to ask you, Costas, it's a bee in my bonnet about this whole notion of free trade. We are hearing ad nauseum that these tariffs are interfering with the global system of free trade. So this is a big picture question, I suppose. But do you think that that's a fair characterization of the international trading system, that it is free? Or is it in fact a rigged game in many ways? What's your view about that?
Where does one start with that one? Free trade, you should know, is an intellectual argument in economic theory that goes back 200 years. It goes back to the great classical economist, to David Ricardo, who proved that lifting controls over trade is the best thing that could happen for wealth creation. And that has remained at the heart of economic theory. Mainstream economic theory, that's what it believes in. And it's not surprising that when you talk to economists at Harvard today, or Princeton, or MIT, or whatever it is, it's 101, right? That free trade is the best thing. And that gets translated into policy as well. It affects policy and so on. Now, we know from history that this message has been adopted by typically the leading country in the world market, which tends to be the leading hegemonic imperialist power. It's not accidental. The Brits believed in it a long time ago and argued it. The Americans adopted it for a period. We also know that throughout these 200 years of world market, capitalist world market, basically what it is, various capitalist powers have used tariffs extensively. They are as much a reality of the world market as lifting controls, actually more of a reality than lifting controls. Most of the time, the capitalist world market has had some kind of tariff, some kind of controls imposed on it, because it's impossible to survive in competition. The thinking behind lifting controls and therefore allowing trade to be free goes back to David Ricardo, who talked about comparative advantage. You've got a comparative advantage as a country. If you lift controls in trade, your comparative advantage will come forth, and therefore you will benefit. You will bring in goods cheaply, inputs, you will produce cheaply, you will succeed in making what you're good at. So that's comparative advantage. That's basically the thinking behind it. And if you don't go that way, then you're making life more difficult for yourself. You're making things more expensive, producing things more expensively than otherwise. Well, theory of comparative advantage is good on paper. David Ricardo was a very brilliant man when he produced these models on paper. But the practice of world trade and the reality seems to indicate that absolute advantage dominates. In other words, if you've got an advantage in world trade, you keep it. And you dominate trade, and you suck in all the ability to trade. You bring it into your own country, and you dominate the world market. And others know it, so they impose controls, they impose tariffs in order to promote their industries. We've known that for a long time. It's impossible to survive without controlling trade. China emerged as a superpower in production by having controls over trade, and that's a long-standing thing. What the United States is doing right now is to try and shore up its domestic productive capacity by imposing tariffs. Trump is telling us that. He's understood it, except that he's going about it in half-half way without understanding the full extent of it, of what he needs to do. From the perspective of radical policies, truly radical policies in favor of working people, what I would say is free trade as a mechanism of wealth creation is a figment of the economist's imagination. And it's a product of abstract economic analysis that has very little bearing on what's happening in the world market and in the capitalist market in general. Controls over trade are necessary. Yes, we need to trade. It's nonsense to isolate the country. You need to trade, but trade must be controlled, trade must be regulated, trade must be part and parcel of a broader industrial policy. And that policy would also include capital control. You cannot allow money to move in and out of the country without any controls in a way that its owner wants to speculate or to interest or whatever the owner wants to do abroad or foreign owners want to do in your own country. You need regulation and you need control, but you need a package. You need a system. You need a strategy. And that's where trade should also find its place.
Right. Well, Costa, it's been a great pleasure talking to you again today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope our audience has found this as informative as I did. And I look forward to our next episode of the Global Economy Report. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it too, Dimitri.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on February 14th, 2025.